a darker mood around the Hawthorns as winter descended in 1987. Situated on Kenilworth Road, this beautiful sandstone home was a little piece of England in Stirlingshire, its address matching perfectly with its owner. Terry Butcher had moved in a year before, with one medal already safely in the collection, and the optimistic promise of more to come. Now he was anxious and depressed. The man who had carried his teammates on his back, both literally and metaphorically, was in tears as he tried to hobble up the stairs, such was the pain from his broken tibia. The year before he'd been a standout performer at the World Cup, and now his European Championship ambitions, to be held at West Germany in 7 months' time, were hanging in the balance. Many visitors and well-wishers had come to the door, including Graeme Souness and some other Rangers players. A new but expected face eventually arrived. He was a Rangers fan, but not one there to collect an autograph or to pass on his best wishes for a quick recovery. "I hate having to do this," he told Butcher, as he arrested him and formally charged the Rangers captain with behaviour likely to cause breach of the peace. He confirmed this with 3 other colleagues via radio. They were doing the same jobs at the homes of Chris Woods, Graham Roberts and Frank McAvenny. The season of revolution that had promised, if not guaranteed, consistent success for a generation or more seemed a long time ago now. On the face of it, very little had changed. At the same stage of the previous season, Rangers had won the Skull League Cup and were 6 points behind the league leaders. This was exactly their situation on November 17th, 87, with the added bonus of progression to the quarter-finals of the European Cup, after dispatching one of the favourites en route, which was to resume in the springtime, as well as the addition of Richard Gough, that much sought-after transfer target of the previous summer. But that snapshot look at history is misleading, as it almost always is. Always not well at Ibrox. The arrogant swagger had turned into a complacent entropy. The manager's obsession with meeting the physical demands of the Scottish game was now leading more and more often to unruly tumult, meaning that rivals knew they simply had to press buttons and stand back. And now Butcher, that almost ever-present totemic figure of the championship season, was out for months. Graeme Souness' Rangers had won a title at full throttle in 1986-87, but were always able to regain control when they hit bumps on the road. The manager's natural energy was harnessed to devastating effect, but now it was becoming unbridled. 1987-88 was a season when chaos ensued, when the Three Bears got tangled up with Goldilocks and ended up in the dock, when brawn too often overshadowed beauty, when young talent was nearly extinguished at the whim of a manager, when a Rangers player suffered the worst racist abuse in the history of the Scottish game, when the big talent could have easily called it quits and gone home for a quieter life. Perhaps this wild disparity is best explained by the fact that it was a season when Walter Smith felt that Rangers were almost back to square one, and Ian Durrant thought that Rangers should have won the European Cup. Incredibly, both men had a point. Here to kick us off in episode 1 of Turmoil, season 87-88, as part of the Dominant series, I'm joined by Andy McGowan. How are you, Andy?
I'm very good, thank you, Martyn.
And John Cowden's here from Athens as well. How are you, John?
Very well. Looking forward to this, weirdly, but yes.
It is weird, doing the research and the writing of these 12 seasons. The most interesting ones are the ones that don't end in the league title, those two. Especially this kind of hidden, almost forgotten, not really talked about season, because it's obviously 86-87 dominates, and then we kick off on the trail to 9. But there's so much going on, so it'll hopefully be an interesting 4 weeks. I want to just ask you to get back into your memories, if you can, as to how it felt being a Rangers fan. Andy, you're still a child at the time, a teenager, and John just that wee bit older, in that summer of 1987, with that title finally back in the bag. And we talked last week about it, maybe just didn't feel like a holy grail, kind of one-off. This was supposed to be the start of your era now. This was coming back. It was the Rangers time. And Rangers with a new strip, with a new sponsor that brought in a lot of money, and that strip even, with the two-tone checks, looked modern. Rangers with a future. Andy, what was life like in 87, that summer?
So I was 11, and doing the research for this episode, I didn't realise how out of touch my memory was with the reality. That summer, you mentioned the strip, and that kind of is what my strongest and sharpest memories are. McEwen's Lager the unveiling of the Rangers strip, because it was a big deal, and that sponsorship was a big deal. Wearing the strip until my mum peeled it off me that summer, because what it was, Martyn, is Rangers were capturing a zeitgeist. This is hard to explain nowadays when we're so adrift from, being we're so isolated in Scotland nowadays, aren't we, as a club and as a support. But in 1988, we were making the culture, and this sponsorship meant something, because it was the first £1 million sponsorship, which was mega in UK terms, in European terms, and world terms. The strip was a big deal because it was all new Rangers, and this was a new uniform, because the strip from before, I think, it had been about for 3 or 4 seasons. There was a sense that we were a juggernaut, and this was just going to continue. We were bolshy, we were confident. Celtic had kind of taken a battering very, very quickly in the space of a season. The whole mindset around Scottish football had been utterly turned on its head, and Souness was still at the forefront of that. So that was my memory, Martyn, that it was a very exciting time to be a Rangers fan. We were setting the tone. We were the most modern and forward-thinking football club in the UK by a country mile, and there wasn't really any sense that it would stop. And how wrong we were.
Well, at least come to a pause. John, you swaggering about your McEwen's lager top round the West End?
No, it's just started work. It was unique, actually, I would say, between that summer and Christmas. It's the only time, I think, in my life where the dream of winning the European Cup and the reality is actually one and the same thing. Going into that whole summer, that is what's on your mind. The league, I don't know if we take it for granted, but we are going for this European Cup. And this is a point when Europe doesn't have a dominant team. No. The bandage has been ripped away from the English, and there is a gap until the Italians under Milan, etc., kick in. But these 3 seasons, 86, 88, I looked up with Stoya, Porto, PSV.
Yeah.
There is a window of opportunity. We are quoted, and we get to Christmas and we're still quoted, which is the unique part, because we've had high hopes in the summer before, and they've crashed about by Christmas, and we've had high hopes at Christmas, but they haven't been there in the summer. This is the opportunity. And across the city, they are a mess. I'd forgotten just how much of a mess they are in every shape or form. The Gang of Four, the Graveyard, Badge, etc. It is Let's All Laugh at Celtic. There is a swagger about us, but there is also that whole thing of it's recognised that we could win the European Cup by not just us, by them, and by the whole of the UK, because we are suddenly the representatives. And it's an awesome feeling. It's a feeling like no other. And no matter how this season turns out, in terms of that swagger, confidence, I'm with Duran. That was a real chance to win the European Cup in my lifetime.
And we will get to all of that in due course over the next 4 weeks. But the summer of '87, over this 12-year period of Souness and Smith the younger, I guess only 1992 is more of a lighter touch, maybe underwhelming in the market. Just not having to do too much now. We'll get to 92 in due course and explain why that is. But the summer of '87 is certainly, compared to your previous summer, where you get the Souness himself and Butcher and Woods, and the world feeling all of a sudden open to just about any player outside of Serie A. But it doesn't really happen this summer. We'll talk about who does come in a minute. But Souness has kind of explained this as being, well, we didn't think there was much to do anyway. Maybe the money wasn't quite there when we wanted it, or immediately there in the summer. But Walter Smith, in his book about 1994, said, look, we just didn't get the quality that we were looking for. The kind of players that were quoted: Glenn Hoddle, Kerry Dixon, Trevor Stevens, Steve Archibald, Graham Sharp, were all talked about in May. Rangers, in the Rangers news, Souness was absolutely clear that more would be coming. He'd be shopping in a bigger marketplace, not entertaining Scotland with its ridiculous inflation because it's Rangers. But who they really were looking for was Mark Hateley. Souness and Smith and Holmes had been in Milan in the April of '87, so the end of that 86-87 season to watch them. They lost 2-0 at home to Sampdoria, ironically enough. But Hateley was leaving, and it was between Rangers and Monaco, and again, Hateley obsessed with this target man. Colin West obviously didn't happen. Boy, he was unfortunate with injury. He'd go to Sheffield Wednesday in September, but this was his next try at this. And Souness thought he'd got him. He thought he'd got his man, and it was. I mean, Andy and yourself have pretty much said, the Rangers were a prospect. It was something to properly consider. The chance of playing in the European Cup or having a tilt at it. Playing in front of 40,000 people. Hateley would later talk about just how important that was to him, playing in front of big crowds. Monaco were only doing 4, but Monaco could offer $7,000 a week at the time, a lot of money. And Monaco, which is a bit different from Govan, Rangers didn't get Hateley at all. He would have had a great season under Arsene Wenger, 87-88, and there's a lot of sliding doors in this particular season, but I do wonder if that was maybe one of the biggest. Net spenders then, we would bring in £500,000, again not inconsiderable, when we got rid of Hugh Burns and Dave McPherson to Hearts. But as soon as we just turned to old friends, John McGregor's contract was taken over from Liverpool. Avi Cohen, who Rangers had tried to sign the previous season, did finally come through the door. Trevor Francis, his pal from Sampdoria, he'd gone to Atalanta, he came in, but it was in a short-term deal because there was some concerns about this kind of long-term knee injury, so it was a very careful contract. When Hateley deal fell through, it was Mark Falco, who was Hateley's next target man. He came from Watford, some change to spare. John, did that, with all your big hopes and dreams that season, did that feel a bit underwhelming, just the summer business compared to the summer of '86?
Back then, no. But we were, what would we say? We'd won the league, we'd bought Roberts, we'd been buying a lot of backup players, I would say, or squad players, and young players. I'd completely forgotten that we were going for Hateley. And even when you said it initially, it didn't register. It is in the papers, but no. He wanted a target man, but so looking at it and you're saying Durrant and Ferguson are a year older. So what are they now, 2021? They're very young. McCoist is really coming into his prime. I think it's more... I wasn't obsessed as much with this target man as being
he was
the one and only. I know he was. Creatively, is getting on a little bit. Where is the backup there? And that kind of thing. And I thought it was... Defensively, he wasn't the best, but he did bring a lot to the team. He was a good footballer, and he got a lot of vital goals the previous season. So
McPherson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is he somebody you would have binned if you were going for that tilt at the European Cup at that point, without replacing them? Which we eventually did with Goff, but I mean, that's 2-3 months away. At that point, I don't know, it seemed strange and it was underwhelming, but we were the champions last year. We had to throw everything at it because we were so far behind. This year, the complacency. Celtic are losing McLeod, McInally, Johnson, McLaren, replacing them with Morrison, McCarthy at the back because they have to, and Billy Stark and Andy Walker. It's not exactly they're trading up, and they are the net spenders laws, but they are the perennial used car salesmen. Got to sell before they buy, and they're almost waiting to see what happens. And you get Safeway's car park or wherever it was where they did the deal with McNeil, etc. It's hard not to be complacent at this point because they are such a mess. It's such a giggle reading it in the newspapers, and it was great at the time because we're champions. And there is this whole thing about Europe in terms of where you're thinking. Because up until the previous season, Ibrox was pretty much a fortress in Europe. But away from home was just a car crash. And we'd come close, I reckon, the previous season. And we'd got it kind of right away from home. Okay, we didn't get through Borussia, but, we had 2 clean sheets in a row. So it was like, things began to click because at that point, you always fancied yourselves at Ibrox. I mean, since I started going in 1970, there's only been 3 defeats at Ibrox in Europe and 3 excellent teams. We don't always get the right result. So, is it confidence? Is it complacency? We've looked at what English teams have done. We know there's a gap. And there's nothing here in Scotland which you believe can actually challenge you at this point. So, yeah, you miss out on Haitley as it transpires. You get Falco, maybe not ideal, but he doesn't have a bad record scoring-wise.
Yeah.
And everybody else, the younger guys, are all that year
older. And with the experience and medal in the pocket.
So we're looking at... I see no negatives in that summer. If I'm putting myself back in the summer of 87... I am ebullient. I am not worried about a thing about we haven't splashed big.
Okay. Pre-season wasn't great. It was low-key again, just in terms of the actual work done. Rangers went to Switzerland and Souness replaced a lot of that high-intensity training just with a lot more matches and some light stuff. The players hated it. Results were mixed, shall we say. The nadir being a 5-0 drubbing from FC Zurich. And there's just, in the squad, this might not be coming through to the supporters that summer, but a kind of growing sense of inertia, perhaps. And I'll come back to something in a moment. Again, we talked about that strip, Andy, and the club just modernising and £1 million for a shirt sponsorship. That was big money for 1987. But fans were just about to realise, who was paying for this revolution, and it would be them, because season tickets doubled in price in some cases. The new Premier Club, which is now obviously the Govan they'd gone from 80 quid to 160 quid. That rise would be £100 if fans chose to pay with credit, of which more and more were doing. David Miller, General Secretary of the Rangers Supporters Association, called it a bloody disgrace, and that a lot of loyal Rangers fans are not going to be at all happy. All 6,000 Premier Club season tickets were sold out by 15th of June, half of them through credit. But with 86, 87, I guess, dominated by cups and queues for tickets, just more and more were unwilling to risk missing out on that, I guess.
Aye, so the youngsters these days have FOMO, fear of missing out. Well, this is my original FOMO, because my recollection was that, me and my dad always used to get me a ticket here or there, and I was very lucky to get along to games, but there was a kind of sense that you had to get it. You had to get a season ticket. This is where it was going. And you either got on board or you were going to miss out. You're literally nobody going to be able to get any games, or at least the very big games. So, my dad's a postman, my mum was a housewife at the time, so it was a dear old game, but we got season tickets. And you're right, Martyn, that kind of epitomised the way things are going. The culture back then in football in the UK was not a season ticket culture. If you had a season ticket at Rangers, you were either a camel coat, up in the main stand, or I think we spoke a couple of weeks ago about the Rover ticket, where you could basically get in and pick your seat and move about with your pals. So the culture was changing completely, and this was the first thing about corporate culture encroaching into football, and some people embraced it, some folk it exciting as it was in the middle of the 80s, you know, and other folk were railing against it. But I remember seeing it as a positive. I must have been a Tory even then, Martyn, when I was 11. I remember thinking, this is great, you know, we're going to be the richest club in Britain. You knew that translated into the transfer market. And it was just excitement upon excitement because we were doing things and introducing concepts that nobody else had thought of, you know. A tunnel. We go to the McCune Lager tunnel, remember? Because folk were throwing coins. Yeah. And we're like, wow, we've got a tunnel. Nobody else had it. So we were just ahead of the game that way. And the Premier Club, that's a flash of the past. That's something I've forgotten about. It's been regurgitated about 5 times since then, hasn't it? Different fashion.
You get your wee tie, your club tie.
Exactly.
Club, yeah. But it is the credit facility, for example. I mean, the reaction to that is hostile because this is... Well, this is for the southeast of London. This is for southeast of England. Sorry, this is not what the working class game should really be. You shouldn't be adopting this. This is kind of, we're going down a slippery slope. You read so many of the letters into newspapers by fans complaining whilst they're buying. I mean, no one, you know, that's the thing. There's a lot of noise generated about it, but you know, they're selling out. So it's a fascinating, and there's a bigger discussion about this particular point, but there is a fascinating tension around the Rangers story from 86 to the early 90s. This revolution was something of a Thatcherite revolution. It was, speculating to accumulate. It was very ambitious, very abrasive. Or you've got a wage cap structure, forget it, we rip it up. We don't sign those kind of players, forget it, we rip it up. And this means a lot to you, don't care. This needs to modernise, this needs to do this, needs to do that. And there's a tension in the fanzine pages, and fanzines will come in the following year about, yeah, we're getting this success, but at what cost? And what does this mean anymore? But we'll maybe dip into that as the series goes on. Okay, so this optimism is shared by bookies and pundits. Rangers odds-on favourites to retain the championship. Most of the writers were on board with that. Alan Davidson, no great Rangers fan, I don't think. Impossible to predict anything other than continued success. Graeme Clark was covering Rangers in Switzerland pre-season. He said the real question in Scottish football was who was going to be second. But there's an interview with Souness right on the eve of the new season that I think is intuitive, that something just isn't quite right, because the market hasn't really delivered for him. It's like a bizarre interview. Someone put it to him that, you know, the confidence and support, confidence of the bookies, you must be overwhelming favourites. And instead of relishing it as that kind of arrogant presence that we'd kind of come to know by then, you would expect him to do that. It's quite defensive. It's quite insecure. He said theirs is a typical Scottish. He basically said, look, the fans will expect everything this season. And Souness said theirs is a typical Scottish reaction. Because we won the league and the Skol Cup last season, they seem to believe that we will not only repeat those triumphs but collect the Scottish Cup as well. It is all nonsense. Everyone has to realise that Rangers have no rights to anything. It's time they change their way of thinking. Now, a manager lowering expectations at the beginning of a season, so to try and oversell by the end, there's nothing new in that. But I'd like both of your thoughts on this, because it runs in real contrast to this confident assurance of the young challenger the season before. I think he knows he doesn't have what he wants in place, and something just isn't quite right, because it's a very un-Souness-like reaction to a question about confidence and success. Andy first then, John, because I found it fascinating.
I was oblivious to this, I've got to say, and it wasn't until we were doing the research for this that this kind of came out, and I'm surprised because as a youngster I'm devouring the Rangers news, like every single column of that Rangers newspaper I am reading it, Shoot Magazine, all that kind of stuff, so I couldn't remember this. Maybe I was too wrapped up in the excitement I spoke about earlier on. The only thing I'm going to throw in the mix for this, Martyn, is that I wonder now, looking back, that, you know, Souness was at war with the world, as we spoke about, you know, and I think it was taking its toll in a manner that we didn't truly realise, probably ever, but we know it took a toll on his marriage, you know, it took a toll on his health eventually, and he's a very different man nowadays from what he was then. I just wonder if that doubt or, you know, consideration that you've just spoken of was coloured by his mental state. You know, I mean that in the literal sense, not just about his footballing mental state, his personal mental state, where he was as a man at that time. You know, I don't know what happened that summer, but looking back at it now, I'm thinking, right, there's more to it than just a feeling like the football squad isn't as complete as you want. I think there might be more to it there, but that might be just me looking too far deep into it, Martyn. But I'm interested to hear John.
I mean, there is an aspect to this that we'll come to at the end, that it's more about Souness the player, because I think he's actually maybe struggling with the end of that identity.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that at the end of the show, because there's one game in particular that probably sums that up. But John, did you find that interesting? I was astounded reading that, because it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit with any kind of press conference he's given as Rangers manager before then. He could be, you know, up and down, and you know, we talked about his poor media management that he learnt from and got a lot better as 86, 87 went on, but this seems quite ratty and just a wee bit defensive, for which is a kind of positive question, really.
I'm like Andy. I have no recollection of this at all. It has no impact on me in that summer. It's a very... I agree, it's a strange thing to say. I just don't remember it. And I have no idea what the basis for saying it is. Because as I say, compared to everybody else in Scotland, we should be looking at winning the treble. The cups are, you know, depends on draws, etc. Celtic are in a much worse position, I would say, at this point than they were. You talk about us losing in pre-season, it's fine. The same night we lose 5, they lose 3-0, is it, to a Swedish team? They lose 5-1 at Parkhead to Arsenal. They're standing. So I don't understand where it is. The only thing, and we might come to at the end, is there's other things going on in his mind, either football or not. And it is a big pressure when you take a step back, managing Rangers, and he's a new manager, 1 year in, and playing. And that's the only thing I can think of is, come at the end, that whole conflicting pressure of managing and playing. It's a tough ask for a big, big club. And we are, I mean, we're front page news. We're ripping up everything. We've got Rocksteady crew coming in instead of the old guys in the gates or the old people in the gates that, you know, they've been there for generations. We have the Premier Club. We take up the McEwen's Lager offer for some unforeseen reason. Again, Celtic refused the exact same offer, except they would have Harp on their jersey. What is going on, I have no idea. And actually, it's a relief to get rid of C.R. Smith. Because, I mean, C.R. Smith, it's like the ones we talked about last week. It's nothing. McEwen's it's not a nationwide brand, but at least it's a Scottish brand that's known across. I really have no recollection of this score. I don't know where it comes from, because there's no tangible proof, unless it's, as we say, conflicting pressures or absolute disappointment in not getting some of his targets. The rest of his were, you know, who knows?
But we talk about players, or your managers must see things in training that we don't see. They clearly have a better understanding of the real dynamics behind closed doors, and it would bear out. I mean, we're going to talk about the start of the season. It's dreadful. So clearly he just, I think, my reading of it, this is, you know, the last press conference before the season opens up. He knows his squad isn't where it maybe was, where he wants it to be. The dynamics aren't quite right, and he'd be right, because, you know, as we'll get to. Not everyone backed Rangers, it should be said in the press. Ian Archer, of course, he thought Hearts would win the title. They'd have a good season, but not quite that good. But even Archer couldn't find room in his top four for Celtic. Summer of change, as you mentioned, John, at Parkhead. Davy Hay lost his job as a consequence of the Rangers' revival. And this is their centenary year. A very emotional thing for Celtic. So they go back to the future, really. They bring back a club icon, club legend, Billy McNeill, both as a player and manager before, very successful, or having some success as a manager. Maybe not a manager in great form. The previous season he managed two clubs down in England, Manchester City and Aston Villa. They both were relegated, so not exactly coming into it, as I said, full of confidence, a lot of form. They'd lost, four of their best players, you've mentioned, John. Johnson, McClare, Alan McInally and Murdo McLeod. One thing we should note about those four, they're all going to either big clubs or big leagues. They're our in the wider sense, Scottish players. They were wanted. Talking about Germany, France, England, some of the biggest clubs in Europe there. And you said who he brought in to make those replacements, but the car park story, John. I mean, it probably highlights just how things were in that summer.
It just captures them in every shape or form. They had a post-season tour to Australia, which was on off. I think they eventually didn't go, and then is it Clydebank shopping centre car park? They do that. McGinn and McNeill do the deal, and you're just thinking, what is this all about? They can't even rent a hotel room or find somebody's chateau or whatever you want to call it to go and have a discussion. It's just. And before the end of the season, McNeill's getting quoted for the Airdrie job. I don't think that was ever going to happen when we realised what Airdrie were like. And you had, they got upset at Danny McGrain. I don't think they were going to wear Billy McNeill. But he has taken Villa down. He's taken Man City down. It's all part of that whole joke. And they lose Morris Johnson on the cheap because he goes to France and there's this convoluted thing. They lose McClare. They want 2 million, and is it 600 that Man U offer? And it goes to tribunal. And just before it starts, Man U say, look, do we have to get through with this? We'll offer you 850. Celtic reject it. And the tribunal says it's 850. It's just... And McInally goes to Villa, so he's in the second division. But it's just, they're not buying anybody. They're shopping in the same pool. Irish, Scottish, somebody with an emotional attachment to that graveyard badge. Where the shamrock comes from, nobody knows, as Billy McNeill would say. And they are... I don't understand... I still go back, I don't understand Souness's nervousness. I can understand his nervousness maybe about Europe if he doesn't feel he's there. But in Scotland at this point, Celtic are a mess. We underestimate their emotional. But really, they put so much emotionally and financially into this season. That's them written off until the 21st century in hindsight. And we're just doing everything in every way. The only thing maybe there's a breather from Holmes and Marlborough because, our overdraft is 4 million at this point. And they must have a change of mind because, as you say, we go on a spending splurge come October and onwards. But is there a reticence? I'm not saying we weren't going to sign Hateley. I don't mean that. But was there a bit of getting McPherson, get some money in, and we're only really going to go for one really top-class player?
I think you're right.
Hateley.
I think you're right. I think it was that. And if it didn't happen, which it didn't, it wasn't a case of, well, we need to go and make a statement anyway. Which, Rangers, let's say, future Rangers summers may resemble something a wee bit closer to that. Rangers need to spend money to be seen to spend money. I think you're right. I think the big target was Hateley. Didn't happen. It would have cost about 2 million. But there was no need to, we need to spend something like that anyway. don't care who it is, who's next on the list that's in that kind of ballpark. But yeah, it didn't come in anyway. One very, very quickly, because we will get to it in another later episode, that summer, in terms of your optimism about Europe. When the draw was made, how optimistic were you?
Personally, it was a tough draw, but I wasn't unconfident. I think Celtic had, and this was another weird thing that came up, Celtic played in the previous season, and Davy Hay has offered us his dossier on them. And I don't think Celtic got demolished by them. I think they did okay-ish. They get put out, of course. But it's one of those rare European Cups where there's probably 10 or 12 teams in there who have a real chance. There isn't a standout that there's lots of favourites or whatever, but there isn't anybody that you're saying, like, I don't know, either an English team or a Galacticos or an Ajax or a Bayern Munich or whatever era. There's just a lot of half-decent, really good, or more than half-decent, good teams in there. And you know you're going to have to play them at some point. So you would like an easy first-round draw, because I didn't get really worried about the start of that season. It was par for the course for us to be dreadful at the beginning of the season. In fact, I was more relaxed when we were awful at the beginning of the season than we started off well. And because experience dictated, we won 2 trebles on the back of wanting Wallace sacked, whereas 81, 82 and 84, 85, we start off pretty decent, and there's car crashes. So the whole, you don't like losing, but I mean, that old computer of things, I mean, we get Hibs away, Aberdeen away, Celtic at Martyn and Dunfermline away. And that initial part, it's not easy fixtures. It's the beginning of the season. The league doesn't start till December for us.
Andy, were you worried by Kiev? Were your hopes deflated?
I remember being told they were one of the favourites to win the bloody thing, and I think it would have been a surprise if we were to get through. I think that was borne out. You know, when we put them out, it was a tremendous victory, which kind of backs that up. So, you know, we'd watched the 1986 World Cup. Half their nearly all their players were basically the Russia team, the USSR team. They'd done really, really well. I remember watching them on the TV, the highlights of the Cup Winners' Cup, I think, when they won, and he had, you know, fantastic players in their team. And, you know, for a team behind the Iron Curtain, they had a lot of players that were well known worldwide. They were that good. So, you know, I remember thinking, Christ, we could be out in the first round here. You know, after doing so much work to get to the European Cup again, this was like, you know, it could be a knockout punch in the first round. So that's my recollection.
Yeah, that fixture computer that John intimated there, the random fixture generator, in that first 5 league games, Rangers are away to Hibs, Aberdeen and Celtic. But the opening game, I'd like your thoughts on this Flag Day, as it's now known. I don't know if it was then. I don't know if it had that kind of name or feel to it. Betty Holmes, the wife of the Rangers chairman, was given the honour of unfurling that league championship flag before the opening game at home to Dundee United. I think it maybe probably not that rare for someone like Betty Holmes to do that, but I think it does tell us something about David Holmes's reluctance to really indulge that limelight, but also Betty Holmes was really just part of that whole thing as well. The two of them really worked hard to build up a real family feel around the club at all levels. A club that was growing off the pitch in terms of the kind of jobs that were being created, but it was. So I think that was probably apt that she did that. She was very, very well liked around the place, and a dreadful performance certainly in the first half. That remember with these difficult fixtures, Butcher, Souness, Roberts all suspended for the first two league games. The central defensive partnership that day of Avi Cohen and John McGregor, badly exposed by an Eamon Bannon ball for Dave Bowman to latch on to. He had 2 chances to get the ball past Woods and finally did so. Ian Durrant comes on at half-time, not starting because, well, surprise, surprise, he's fallen out with the manager. This would be a theme of this season. But he clicks Rangers into another gear. McCoy gets a thoroughly deserved penalty and scores from that. Good link-up play with Falco. Hits the post. So, a point dropped. Game of 2 halves, it reads, and certainly from what I've seen, disappointment. Again, that Dundee United game early in the previous season, maybe floating about, I don't know.
Anti-climax, and the first thing I'll point out is that, Dundee United are a cracking team, are a really, really good team. Great players, good manager, well drilled, always a hard game, home and away against Dundee United. So, and it's only 2 points, obviously, for our wins. But I think this is where the kind of, if you're a more savvy bear at that time, I certainly wasn't thinking this way, but if you're a savvy bear at that time, you'd be thinking, we've maybe stood still here, because the McGregor, I would probably say the triangle of McGregor, Francis, and Avi Cohen just stunk of old pals. The Liverpool connection with Cohen and McGregor, and then obviously Sampdoria for Trevor Francis. And I remember McGregor, I don't think many folk had heard of McGregor. And Cohen was a well-known name, but, by and large, the thinking was that he was done. He was like yesterday's man, and he was this kind of 80s novelty that Liverpool had an Israeli player, which was unheard of then. And that game, they get badly exposed, as you said, because I don't think McGregor was even a centre-half, and Cohen was as slow as a week in jail, is my recollection. So, there was this clear reliance on, for lack of a better phrase, our star players, which were Butcher and Roberts. And so it wasn't a disaster to draw with Dundee United at home, but, the expectations are now there to the point where you're expected to beat them, despite them being a really, really good team. And a quick word on David Holmes. My recollection back then was that, a lot of folk would be saying we're so thankful, grateful to Souness for what he did, and then in the next sentence saying David Holmes. That was the kind of thing. Nobody was daft enough to think that Souness came in and did this all himself, because Holmes was the man that actually came up with the, dare to dream and get him over. So there was a huge amount of goodwill and gratitude towards David Holmes, plus the fact that he carried himself in a manner that, we kind of, even nowadays, we kind of strive for this kind of, whatever way you want to call it, Struth-esque, a person that's neither up nor down, gentlemanly, polite, but strong, and, presents himself in a certain manner. And David Holmes epitomised it. So it's interesting what you said there. I never thought it that way, Martyn, that he was too modest, I suppose, to actually be the man that goes out and unveils that flag. Because I remember Betty Holmes, she was an old woman to me. Yeah. I remember, what's this old woman doing it for? But, I can look back at it and understand.
Yeah, as I said, she's part of the story as well. The two of them really worked hard to foster this this kind of dynamic through the club. John, you said there that this is what good Rangers teams do. They start badly, like Italy at World Cups. But 1-1 draw at home, 1-0 defeat Easter Road, I think 2-0 defeat at Pittodrie. So 3 games gone, 1 point. Again, big players missing. So you can present the caveats, but it's it's not an ideal start. You remember the reaction? Or is everything tempered by the fact that, right, this is kind of what Rangers do anyway? But remember last season, how far back we were, and we click into gear, as you said, as the Scottish winter comes, and then just disappear over the horizon. I guess that doesn't stop your super scoreboard, open line kind of sensationalism, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not something I ever listened to since the early days, but there is a degree, and it's all the context. At this point, and there should be a flag up, that Celtic are struggling a bit. They beat Hearts at Parkhead with a late goal, recurring theme. whilst I think it's Kevin O'Donnell, who was that era's Clancy, denies Hearts 2 penalties, allegedly. I never watched it, but if Sandy Jardine got booked for dissent, complaining about it, you would tend to suggest they might have been of the Stonewall variety. And then Celtic lose it in Fairmont as well, the week before they play us. So there is text of what happens elsewhere. And there is a complacency from us of, well, we gave them 8 points a start last year. And I can remember us talking about that on buses. You're not happy at losing. You're certainly not happy at losing to the Sheep. You're not happy at losing to Hibs. I could never get into the whole flag days. They always seem to be disasters or flat things, and not quite as bad as the McDowell in a couple of seasons.
We'll get
with
to
Woods.
that. Yeah, we'll get to that.
But it is, and coming out, it was very reminiscent of, for me, of the first title I saw, which was when Hilda Waddle came out and unfurled the flag in front of Hymns. Actually, we played that day. So the panic button hasn't been set. It is strange now thinking, well, you know you're going to Butcher and Roberts out, but you've punted McPherson. You've brought in Cohen, who I thought had played for Liverpool much more recently than they had, but I mean, it's been 6 years away. And McGregor, is he ever fit? Because he seemed to come to us and almost immediately get a knee injury.
Yeah. Oh, and
and
this
you
would
just
be a
think
running
Liverpool were being a bit cute, and for all the professionalism it's brought. Yeah, that whole looking after injuries and things, yeah, certainly was a weakness. So, and we're progressing in the League Cup, and Ali scored. Does he not score back-to-back hat-tricks?
He did,
or whatever,
yeah. I mean,
as
the
well?
Skull Cup's always got that sucker, I suppose, for Rangers. Away to Dunfermline, who had beaten Celtic in the league in the weekend before. Rangers win 4-1, and then Falkirk in the league 4-0 win with another hat-trick. So yeah, at least McCoy isn't suffering from any of that. And that means we go to Parkhead for the first Old Firm game of the season. And Rangers make a signing, but not the kind of Graham Roberts-esque signing pre-New Year. It's £200,000 on Dunfermline youngster Ian McCall. We did try to buy Robert Connor, or Bobby Connor, depending on who you speak to, of Aberdeen, for £300,000. So again, prepared to spend the money, just not quite getting the targets aligned. Not quite the financial flex that we'd seen before, I suppose. Well, if the first Old Firm game of the last season was this cool 1-0 professional, serene performance, well, this wasn't.
Oh, very fast and furious. Bully Stark. Oh, Nils Roy Aiken incensed by that. Bully Stark had his boot off, and that will be Souness off. He's already been booked, and Rangers are down to 10 then. The Rangers players manager sent off yet again.
Okay, John, I presume you were there. Andy, I'm not sure you were allowed to go to Parkhead at that age. 1-0 defeat. It just looks ragged. It looks unchecked. Durant can he find a pass? Cooper's half fit. Butcher is out completely. And Souness is, I mean, that tackle on Billy Stark is it's atrocious. It's wild. I think that there is that very distinct contrast between these two opening Old Firm games that can sometimes, although we search maybe too much for this kind of narrative neat arc, they do sometimes set the tone for the season. And this was very, very different, John.
Unfortunately, it was pretty much the same. And I'm talking pre-Souness. You know, you go to Parkhead and bad things happen. And the difference from the previous season is it's stark, as you say. The previous season, of course, with Butcher, and we have a much fitter team, vibrant team at home, and no Souness. Souness, this is the third time within a year in a huge game. He's a liability. It's not even the fact it's a dreadful tackle, because it's not a one-off. It's the fact that it's another dreadful tackle at a time in a game where you can't afford it. You know, I don't think he ever really gets what happens at Parkhead, where they are this whirling dervishes and, you know, and come out at 1,000 miles an hour. And you can fight fire with fire. I don't really think that's ever the best thing. I think Smith eventually got it right.
Yeah.
But as soon as he gets caught up in it when he's playing, you know, it's not. He's not in control. He's not at the height of his powers, which he was in the previous January, when he's spraying passes about, making them look stupid, etc. It's more. It's Easter Road. It's Pittodrie. It's just another car crash. I can't explain it in any other different way. That it was just another here we go again at Parkhead, where only, I suppose, Woods and McCoy's turn up, and very few others.
Yeah, I mean, this chat about his conduct record, which was never bad in England, famously, and was obviously very dreadful very quickly here. And I guess for all the class that he could still exude on the ball, and he had lost a yard of pace off it, and he wasn't listening to his body. He was continually rushing himself back when he wasn't properly fit. He would say, you know, Rangers always came first in my book, and I was prepared to take any personal risk to keep them in the chase for honours. That's all well and good, but if you're not, you know, the guy that we needed him to be, then it's not really any use to us, and it was counterproductive. You know, that muscular presence that Souness knew was required in Scotland, you know, it still needed to be matched with nimbleness and wit. Otherwise, you know, those yellow cards, red cards would just, you know, keep in step with the injuries. And I think he's a very frustrated man, because he knows his career's coming to an end as a player, and I imagine that's very, very difficult to deal with. That is the most red card of red cards you'll see. He wasn't happy. He waited for David Syme, the referee, outside of Parkhead that day. He got hold of him, and he called him, I'm quoting here, a big fucking poof, and later that night told David Holmes that he'd had enough. Again, this is a man just not dealing with a lot of these internal frustrations. This world-class footballer, this identity that he carried for, I think, most of his adult life, to be fair, was nearing its end, and I think it sets the tone for the season, just in his decision making, his control, which is chaotic, and it's absolutely all over the place. Andy, your memories of this afternoon?
Just Souness tackle. That is the only memory I've got. I wasn't there, and you obviously watch the highlights, and I've looked at it again, and it just what we were talking about earlier about Souness in his state of mind, and you've just encapsulated it brilliantly, Martyn. He looks like a man out of control. You know, for a guy that conducted himself, you know, physically through all his glory years in the English League with an all-conquering Liverpool team. This was, you know, he came up to Scotland, he was getting sent off, he was getting a name for being sent off, he'd made himself a target, and then an occasion like this, he was just giving them it, you know, he was laying it up on a plate. I mean, Billy, I laugh because I watched the tackle again, and I'm like, Billy starts now and get up, one of his boots is off, and he still goes through the back of him. It's like an assault. And he did it again later on the season when I think it was still a Bucharest, and there was something no right there. And I think you've got it. I think it's the fact that his body, don't quite failing him, but you know, he must have got that time in a player's career that when you're wanting your legs to do one thing and they're not quite doing it, and this was maybe the frustration in him, because he was a proud man, we know that, and his standards were so high that maybe just the slip in standards, the fact he knew he couldn't do what he had become known for, was so so powerful. It was such a strong thing, and within him that he couldn't do it, that he couldn't handle it. Aye, that's all I can remember that game. That's time to. I implore MD to go and watch it. It's hilarious.
Yeah, well, what I find interesting about this season, we will talk about it over the next few weeks. That's fine on the pitch. I can kind of get that. I do understand that, because it's, in the heat of battle, it's anxiety levels, adrenaline levels must be, through the roof if you're a professional football, especially in these key hyped up games. And someone who's been able to do so much, so naturally, so well over their career, just not being able to quite get there, just losing that yard. I can kind of get that, but it's the decision making off it. It's his presence off the field, just in his managerial role, as we will come on to time and again through this season, that is just off the charts. I mean, it's just out of control. And again, I go back to this weird summer of inactivity, a weird pre-season, where he remember he came in 86, hammering the fitness thing in a proper professional way. No sand dunes involved. There's nothing of that. It's light touch. It's just very out of step with everything, I guess, that we'd come to expect for the previous 12 months, and it bites us. And what's so interesting about this summer, David Holmes at the end of 86, 87 has said, look, there's no point in all this money coming in from these fans. We've built it and they've come. And we're so grateful that they've done that, and they've come in their thousands and thousands and thousands. This money's come in. It's no good keeping the bank manager happy. We need to reinvest that. We will do, and we don't in that summer. Yet between October and February, as we'll discover, Rangers spend nearly £3 million on 5 players that would be beloved, 3 of whom would be here till the very end of this series. And who knows how life would have been different if Haitley had come through the door. But even Souness's aversion to dealing with Scottish clubs, because he does eventually, in the case of Ian Ferguson, John Brown, sensible signings. Fergie took a wee while to adjust, but clearly, cup winning goal for St Mirren a few months before. He is one of the up and coming midfielders in the Scottish game. That could have been done that summer, but he just wouldn't deal with Scottish clubs until he kind of had to. That kind of pig-headedness, it just ducks just weren't in a row, and it could cost us.
I think he's having a midlife crisis.
He may well be.
Well, what you're describing, and I forgave him for Pittodrie. I kind of got it. In hindsight, he gets rid of McPherson allegedly because of the Hamilton game. Now, at that point, I'm not saying he gets rid of himself. He's cost us against Hibs, potentially cost against Pittodrie, and now he should be retiring. Maybe not saying it. He should be taking him, and somebody like Holmes or Smith or both of them should be having quiet words, because being a manager of Rangers is also a stressful thing. And if you can't handle it and your body's aging, You've got to make the big decisions. Yeah. You have to make the big decisions. If you want to do the best thing for Rangers and it's not playing, then you don't play.
Yeah.
And he is becoming more a liability. 86, 87, you can rhyme off the games, the performances. From the summer of 87 onwards, I'm struggling to remember really big games where he's putting his foot on the ball. And you can't say, you might say he's got a target on his back, Scottish referees. Can any of his, and I defend just about any Rangers player, can any of us defend those 3 sending-offs?
None.
They are nothing. And one, I get it, 2, the last game of the season, the emotional winning.
Yeah.
But at that point, you sit down this summer and say, you know what? I'm not. And I would say he should be buying someone for himself, which he eventually does when he gets Wilkins later. But at this point, I do think he's in that sort of midlife crisis of, as you say, my body's given up. And it's all subconscious, I'm sure of it. I'm that bit slower. I should be beating these idiots because I know I'm a better player, but they're snapping at me. They're younger, they're fitter.
Might have been easier.
I get all of it.
Yeah. It might have been easier if he had a really, really bad injury.
Yes.
Which he didn't.
Absolutely.
And he was very fit. He was very fit. I mean, famously fitter than a lot of these young players that he'd taken over.
In 86, it's maybe 87, the light touch training,
but again,
to hide the fact that he can't do it.
Yeah.
Don't know.
But this is part of the that's probably an unavoidable, inherent part of the nature of the arrogant driving force, this force of energy, which is what Graeme Souness really was as a manager, as we'll discover, actually limited as a football manager, certainly as football changed after Ibrox, but as a force of nature, he is what we needed in 86. I don't think that's really up for much debate. Guys like that tend not to be that well reflective, and they don't tend to have a lot of doubts, and it takes them a long time. And by the end of this season, he does know. He plays a handful of games, really. Certainly starts a handful of games over the next 2 seasons. But it was... I don't think it's realistic, given the type of person he is, the nature of that kind of individual, holding 2 trophies and saying, I did this, to suddenly go, well, you know what, I'm out. His pal down the road, I mean, I know Dalglish is, 2 years older than Souness, I think, but he only managed 1 year as player manager. It's too hard. It
was ego.
Yeah.
Ego. There's a difference between the two. Souness's ego was so massive, and his vanity and his pride versus Dalglish. I think that's as simple as that. I mean, I jumped forward a couple of seasons, and you remember Souness comes on to kind of guy sell a last stand. Yeah. Comes on as a substitute, pulls his calf within about 3 minutes. He should never have been on the bench.
No. Well,
I think it's ego.
I think it is, but I don't think you get what we got in 86, 87 with that kind of presence. I think it's unrealistic to hope for that kind of level of self-awareness, doubt, whatever else. Gentlemen, as always, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. You'll be back on in a couple of weeks. Thank you, Andy.
My pleasure as always, Martyn. Make a trip down memory lane.
And John, thank you.
Thank you, Martyn. It was a much better summer than I thought in hindsight. The times were fantastic, despite all of what we've discussed.
Well, they were, and we're going to get to that next week, because as chaotic and as tumultuous as this season was, it still has a magic. And as David and Alan and I will discuss next week, we have Kiev, we have an outrageous Old Firm game, and we have probably the most fun cup final that Scotland has ever seen. Until then, bye for now.